Hello and welcome to the Config Manager Technical Preview Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Zenert. You can catch me on Twitter at TheZenerd. I hope everybody is adjusting to staying at home and staying safe. It honestly feels like Tiger King came out 3 years ago and it was only like 3 weeks ago that I binge watched that series. So I need something new to binge watch. Let me know down in the comments what I should be binge watching right now. This episode of the podcast is going to cover Technical Preview 2004. But before we get started with that, I'm going to throw out a couple of shameless plugs. The first one goes to my user group, MeMug. We meet on the fourth Friday of every month from 3 to 5 p.m. Mountain Time. Sometimes we adjust that time a little bit if we have more speakers. But come join us, memug.org, and also the Sysman Squad. If you were looking for a place to blog or get some mentoring on blogging, speaking, or just general life coaching with career goals and aspirations, feel free to join us there. That's sysmansquad.com. So with that, let's kick it off with my top 3 features for Technical Preview 2004. The first improvement I want to talk about is the addition of Config Manager client details to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager tenant attach feature. So if you've been keeping up with the current branch releases, you'll know that in 2002, they released the ability for you to attach your Config Manager environment to Azure and have basically some synchronization options for devices that you bring into the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. So you could sync user and device policies, and you could run the application evaluation cycle. So this technical preview release brings with it some more detail coming from the devices and some more information about collections. I would love to show you this feature. Unfortunately, it's not working in my environment. Now this is a preview experience, so you're not going to be able to see it in the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center just yet, but when you do, you're going to be able to see things like the last policy refresh, the last active time, what management point the device belongs to, and you'll be able to see boundary groups as well for that device. Now the caveat with boundary groups is they only work for standalone primary sites, so they're going to be empty for anybody who uses a CAS. And the logged on user only populates when at least one user has logged into the device after the Config Manager client has been installed. Next on the list, we have notifications from Microsoft. Microsoft can now communicate to you through the Config Manager console issues like break fix. So when you have a known issue affecting your environment that might require you to take some steps, they can notify you about upcoming changes that may require you to perform certain actions. True story, like when the migration from hybrid MDM to co-management took place and you had to get your devices off of hybrid MDM before a certain date. I definitely had a client who was burned by that. We were able to recover him, but still, there's another notification channel for Microsoft to tell you about these things now. And in addition, Microsoft has the ability to communicate new features or updated features that are available in the console to you as well. So we can take a look at how to enable this in the console. In Config Manager Technical Preview 2004, it was enabled automatically for me. So let's check this out. Inside of our Configuration Manager console, we're going to open the Administration blade, expand Overview, expand Site Configurations, click on Sites, and right-click on our primary site and select Properties. When this opens, we're going to select the Alerts tab, and if we zoom in here, we have the ability to set some notifications from Microsoft. Like I said, this is going to be your prevent fix options, your plan for change notifications, and your stay informed notification. And you can enable some or all of these at your leisure, and these notifications will show up in the Configuration Manager console. Finally, rounding off my top 3 features, we have improvements to the task sequence step for formatting and partitioning disks. So now you can use a task sequence variable to define which disk you're formatting and partitioning. And you might be asking yourself, but Nathan, this was already available if we use the OSD disk index variable. And yes, you would be right. However, that was just a single variable. Now you can use multiple task sequence variables to define multiple partitioning structures for multiple disks. So in theory, you could use a front end like UI++ to populate a list of disks for your technicians to image and choose a disk on which to install the OS. And this will help with obviously disk prioritization and making sure that the OS ends up on the correct disk that you want it to. You can still use OSD disk index, but each instance of the format and partition step will use that index. So unless you're resetting it in between each format and partition step, you're going to have a bad time. So let's take a look at this really quick. Back in our Configuration Manager console, we're going to open up the software library, expand task sequences, and open up this task sequence that I've created here. And you'll notice this task sequence just has 2 steps, but what I'm doing is setting a primary disk variable, and I'm just going to call it myOSDisk, and I'm going to say that this disk's index is 1. And then when we create a format and partition step, we now have the ability to set the variable name that we have stored this index in, or this disk number. Pretty easy, pretty slick, and it doesn't rely on you changing the OSD disk index variable between each format and partition disk step if you had multiple. So those are my top 3 features. Let's take a look at the rest. The first one is we now have the ability to copy discovery data from within the console directly. So if you've ever found yourself wanting to copy, let's say, the MAC address of a device or even the distinguished name of the device directly from the Config Manager console easily, we now have the ability to do that. So we're going to go back over to the Config Manager console. We're going to open up the Assets and Compliance blade, take a look at devices, and then right-click on one of our devices that we want to get data for, and select Properties. And you'll see down here in the Discovery Data section, we now have the ability to right-click on one of these items, say the distinguished name for a device, and copy its value, copy the property name and the value, or we also have the ability to select all, and that'll allow us to copy all of the properties or all of the values. And we can also actually save these results to CSV, which is just a nice way to quickly export all of the settings or discovery data for a device. Next, we have some more improvements to CMPivot. In Technical Preview 2003, you had the ability to pivot from CMPivot to a single device. In Technical Preview 2004, you can now pivot to multiple devices selected from a CMPivot. And additionally, CMPivot standalone and the CMPivot that you launch from the console are now actually the same thing. So the console is now launching a standalone CMPivot client. So you have just a unified experience there. Back in the console here, we're going to select Device Collections, and we're going to run CMPivot against the All Systems collection, since I only have 8 devices in this environment and only 2 of them actually have clients installed. And let's just run something like the BIOS CMPivot. If we run this query, we should get some information back. Now that we have some results back, you'll see we've got 2 devices in this list, and if we right-click on a single device, we can device pivot. But if we select multiple devices here, and right-click, and select Device Pivot, we're going to get a new CMPivot window here, and you will notice that we now have listed 2 devices at the top rather than just the name of the single device that we pivoted from. If you're a PowerShell guru and you've been waiting for PowerShell 7 support with Config Manager, Technical Preview 2004 does bring that support. However, there's a couple of caveats. You can't launch PowerShell 7 from within the Config Manager console, so you'll have to open up PowerShell 7 console by yourself and then import the Config Manager module so you have access to those commandlets. Almost all of the commandlets that are available should work with a few exceptions. The import-export commandlets or anything with the import-export verb may not work as expected. And it only supports the Config Manager module commandlets. So features that use PowerShell like CMPivot, run scripts, or the run PowerShell script task sequence step still may not support PowerShell 7. If you encounter issues with any commandlets that you expect to work within PowerShell 7, make sure you submit feedback so that the team can look into that and rectify any issues that they may encounter. Coming down to our last 2 improvements in Technical Preview 2004, we have some additional management insights, and this time for operating system deployment. So the first one, we're actually taking the unused boot images management insight and moving it into the group for operating system deployment. Secondly, there are two new insights specific to large policies. If you've got a rather large task sequence, Microsoft is going to, or Config Manager console is going to try to notify you that these may cause policy processing issues on clients. So when you have a device that attempts to process a task sequence and that policy is over 32 megabytes in size, ultimately the client won't execute the task sequence. So Microsoft is going to provide you some insight into task sequences that may be contributing to large size and insights into total policy size where task sequences would exceed that policy limit of 32 megabytes. Taking a look in the console, if we open up our administration blade, expand Management Insights and select All Insights, you will now see this Operating System Deployment Insights. And if we double click on this, we will see these three rules that have executed on my machine. The first one being unused boot images. And we're going to go ahead and have it reevaluate that really quick. While we wait for that to evaluate, we'll take a look at these other two. I have nothing in here that would cause this to flag as failed, but we do have the total policy size for task sequence exceeds policy limit, and the large task sequence may contribute to exceeding maximum policy size. Now that our unused boot images insight is completed evaluating, we can take a look at more details. And interestingly enough, this actually doesn't show anything even though one of my two base boot images isn't in use, which would be the x86 boot image. I suspect this is because they are actually excluding those two default boot images from this scan, but I am going to seek some clarification on that just to make sure that that wasn't an oversight. Now, Microsoft does provide some guidance when you run into this 32 megabyte policy limit. The first part of that guidance is if you can split your task sequence into child task sequences with logical steps, then each task sequence is going to have a 32 megabyte policy limit. So you can effectively increase the amount of policy that can be processed by a machine. You can also reduce the number of software updates deployed to a collection where a task sequence is also deployed to that collection, because they're going to evaluate all of that policy. Additionally, if you're running scripts, if you're entering the scripts rather inside of a task sequence rather than referencing a package, Microsoft recommends referencing those scripts in a package instead to reduce the size of that task sequence policy. There's an 8 kilobyte limit on your task sequence environment, so if you're adding a lot of custom variables, make sure you're not doing so many that you're exceeding the 8 kilobyte limit for that. And as a last resort, if none of that works, Microsoft recommends splitting ultra complex task sequences into separate task sequences that are deployed to distinct collections that would be relevant to those particular task sequences. But that's obviously a last resort, and hopefully you wouldn't have to reach that. Finally, we have two new PowerShell commandlets for task sequence deployment types. So those are deployment types within an application that reference a task sequence. You have the add CM task sequence deployment type and set CM task sequence deployment type. So this will allow you to manage task sequences that are deployment types within an application via PowerShell. And it uses a similar syntax to the MSI deployment type commandlets, just the install task sequence ID replaces the install command parameter, and uninstall task sequence ID replaces the uninstall command parameter. Well, that's going to wrap things up for Technical Preview 2004. A lot of great new features that are coming that I hope to see in the next current branch release of Config Manager. If there's anything in the video that I didn't explain well enough, or you wanted to see a demo of that I didn't demo, shoot me a comment down below and I would be happy to record a quick video and demo that for you. But otherwise, until next time, happy adminning.